Good morning, everybody. I had some questions recently regarding my connectivity to the ACC API through my Revit add-in. And so I thought I'd put together a short video here that kind of outlines the steps that I went through to make the reference library that I'm using, or at least a very small portion of it, to connect to the API. So I'm just going to kind of walk through really quick steps on how to set this up, and hopefully it'll help. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to start a new project in Visual Studio. This is not going to be a full Revit add-in. Like I said, I'm going to make a reference library that you can link into um, your regular full add-in if you'd like. So I'm going to go here, create a new project. I'm going to do a class library.net framework. And I know with 25 things will be changing, but this is what we're going to do for today. And I'm just going to name it ACC test. All the rest of that should be good. Make sure it's .4.8 at least if you want to work with 24 before. Go ahead and create that library. So once this thing loads up, then obviously we'll have just our default stuff here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this first. I don't usually like to use that. All right, so this is where we're going to start with. What I would suggest doing as the next step is going out and making an app. So you can get to your apps or create a new application. If you go to aps.autodesk.com, you'll want to sign in, and then if you go under your picture up here, you can go to applications, and it should land you on this page. Obviously, I have another app that I've been using. If you want to make a new one, just go ahead and create application. And again, I'm just going to name it the same thing here. And really all we're looking for is to get some information from this. I'm going to go to a traditional web app that kind of gives us the most flexibility if you want to do some different things with it. So I'm going to go create. Then you'll see here we have a client ID and a client secret. These are a couple of parts that we're going to want to keep a hold of. We can name it, give it a description. The callback URL in this case is fine because we're going to be using a two-legged auth through that client secret and client ID. So we don't really necessarily need to have a callback for this, but if you're wanting to do a three-legged or an actual user auth, then you would want to get this set up. There's some other information that's out there that you can find on setting that up. Um, this is where you want to be a little bit careful on selecting which API because some of them do have paywalls associated with them, but some don't. In this case, all you need is the Autodesk Construction API, and I'm going to go ahead and use the BIM 360 API as well because there are some of the endpoints that you actually need to use coming from that side as well. So it just makes it easy to turn that on and make sure you have it running. Really, that is all you need to do here. Go ahead and hit Save Changes. And then while this is saving, what I'm going to do back in the application over here is I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of folders just to try to help keep things organized just a little bit. Then I'm going to name this one Utils. Under the Utils, I'm going to make a new class. And I'm going to call it Credentials. And by no means, please take how I set things up as the right way or the way that you should be doing it. This is just what works for me. So this is why I do it this way. And I'm going to do a public string client ID, get set, and then we're going to go do this for just a second, and I'll do public string. Apparently it does not want me to type that unless I close this off up here. So client secret, yes, close that off, and then we'll do public string account ID as well. And so the account ID is something that you're going to need to get via the ACC. The easiest way to do that is if you just log into ACC or BIM 360 and then go to your account admin page. You have to be an account administrator. Go to the account admin If you do that, then go to BIM 360 settings if you're not already on the BIM 360 side. And then if you go to settings, in the bottom left-hand corner of that screen, there's a little thing that says view account ID. And that's the number that we're going to plug in here once we get that. So if we were to go back over here to this app, I'm just going to copy the client ID. I'm going to put that in there. Then I'm going to copy the client secret, put that there. And then I'm just going to leave both of those there for now. I'm just going to put that in. So we won't actually see this working just yet, but I'm just going to leave that account ID off. We can go ahead and clear up usings at the top. So now we have our credentials class that we can use kind of across the entire app. So we can close that back down. Then the next thing I want to do is go up here and go to references. And what we want is we're going to bring in a NuGet package. We're going to bring in RestSharp. There's other REST API interfaces that are out there. If you want to use something else, obviously feel free. This one I think works pretty well for me. The nice thing about it is that it relies on the system.text.json, which is the other piece that we're actually going to need to make this work as well. So I'm just going to go to the latest version is fine. Pull that package in. So we have that reference in the project. And then once we have that, we can go make a couple more folders here. And I'm going to name one of them endpoints. And then I'm going to name another one models. So if we go to the models, then what I want to do is start to create some of the actual data models or the class structures so that we can deserialize the information coming that we get from the calls. So I want to go in and I want to make a new class. And the first class I'm going to do is I'm going to do a token. And again, you can name this however you'd like. It does not matter. Let's go ahead and make that public. That way we can access it once we start referencing this back into other things. So the token class is going to have 5 different pieces with it. You could do it in 3, I think, depending on how you're doing your auth. Like, again, between 2-leg and 3-leg, there's a couple of different pieces there. If you're doing like a 2-leg, you don't get a refresh token. If you're doing a 3-leg, you do. But why don't we do public string token type? So that public string expires. And you don't necessarily need all of these if you don't need the values from them. I just like to make all my classes the right thing to start with, just so that way if I do need the values, we can get them. So refresh token, and then open string. So those are the 5 different fields that are properties that we need in this token class. Again, I'm going to pull those usings off. And I am actually using within the namespace and going in and using those as models or endpoints just to kind of help keep the structure clean. Certainly don't have to if you want it to be a little bit shallower. Then the next one I want to add here is I'm going to call it a projects. And that's what all we're going to do is do a get endpoint on projects after we get logged in. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add. And the reason I'm calling it projects is the way the API works is that when you do a get on a list of projects, you're just trying to return a listing of projects. It actually gives it to you in a paginated form. So you don't just get a base listing of projects or an array of them. You actually get a paginated report, has a couple of links in it potentially, and then you get the results of the actual project itself. So we have to have a projects class to then hold the project or a list of projects once we get there. So we're going to do public, and I'm going to turn that pagination into a class as well, and then do the get set on that. And then we'll also do system. And then I'm going to do project, which will be another class we'll make here in a second. And that is results. With things like this, where these are the lowercase pagination results, those are the actual values that are coming from the API. So you want to make sure that you get those cased correctly, and you want to spell them as they're spelled. Obviously, you can get that from the API reference guide that is online. So just for the sake of making this a little bit simpler and easier, I'm going to go ahead and create this pagination and this project class actually right here. Normally I would break them out, but I'll just make them right here so they're kind of easy to see together. And we'll make that. And we'll make this. All right. So this pagination class is pretty straightforward as well. There's an int, which is limit. And then, actually, that can be used if you want to limit the number of results. You can do public int offset. That will tell you what the offset is that you called it from. There's an int that is total results. So if it happens to be less than or equal to the limit, I think on projects the limit is 100 that you can get at one time. I have to verify that, but I think that's right. And then the string is next URL. And then the final one here is a string, which is previous URL. So those are the values that are in the pagination class. That's what, again, is going to be coming results returned from the API when you pull that down from projects from the Git endpoint. Now, if we look at project, I'm just going to do a couple fields. There's almost 20 different fields that come from the API. I'm just going to do the ones that are absolutely required, and then we're going to limit the actual Git later, the fields that are in that, to keep it to these as well. So let's do public string ID, public string name, and then public string job number. So those are the ones that we want to use to start with on the project. So when we do the get, we're going to call it. When we get it, it's going to return it's going to deserialize the JSON to a projects class. Within that, it's going to give pagination information, and then it's also going to give us a list of project classes, which is actually the results from that call. So that's the projects classes. That should give us mostly of what we need there. So then I'm going to come up here to the endpoints folder that I made. I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it the projects endpoint. And then again here, I'm going to make this public. Go ahead and remove those. And then we are going to then make a public static projects. That's what we're wanting to return. We'll see why that's not in a second. Project. I'm just going to call this get, and we're going to start. I'm just going to start there for the time being. All right. So that's going to be the foundation of what we need. And then we also, I'm going to make another one here, which is going to be the token endpoint, which again will be a public class. And then we're going to make a public static token. And we can just call this get as well. All right, right, so we got that going there too. So let's actually, let's start with this token endpoint so that we can actually get the token to start with. What we first want to do is we want to include our models using up there. That'll get us going. And then what we're going to want to pass into this is the string client ID. And again, we put these values in that credentials class, which we can pull from. I think normally you would want to pass these through, so that's why I'm making them parameters in the method. But that we would want to pass the ID, the client secret, which obviously is a string value as well. And then you can also do things like scopes or grant types, passing them through, but we'll just define those in here statically. So once we have the client ID and the client secret passed, then this is when we're going to want to use REST client. Um, client. So we want to make a REST client. Again, this is using RestSharp. You can see that using has been added up there. And then we want to create that. And one other piece I might do here real quick is under the utils, we'll make another class. And I'm going to call this paths. And on the path stuff, I want to add some information that is going to make this kind of easier to use. So I'm just going to leave this internal because we're not going to be doing anything with it exterior, but I'm just going to copy and paste here for the sake of a little bit of ease. And the reason I'm wanting to do it this way is so that we can start to do some concatenation on our URLs, because there is like a base URL, and then there's some additional pieces that we need for either auth or for project calls or for different pieces like that. And so you'll see here, once I get these pasted in real quick, that we're just going to be building up. We're just going to be building up the URLs to use, and this will make it a little bit easier on calls. So we have the base URL, which is just the Autodesk developer, kind of the basic address, and then we have the authentication, which is the back end of that. We just have ACC v1, which is the primary kind of next piece after the base URL when we're actually doing ACC calls, project endpoint, etc. And then what we have our accounts v1 that's down there, that actually lets us get into like, for instance, some of the other authentication or project stuff that we need to pull from. So I have those paths now. And then when we go back over here to this, then what I want to do to start with is I want to start by passing that in. So I want to do paths, and this is going to need to pull utils. So paths dot authentication URL. That's when we want to pull her, since we're getting the token. And that's all we need to do for that. And then once we have the REST client we're starting with, we want to do a REST request. That request, and it's going to be a new request. And here is where we want, oh, actually, sorry, this is REST client, new REST options. And the reason I want to use the options is because I want to also set the max timeout. I think by default this is set like a really, really, really high number. I was running into issues where it wasn't timing out, and so it was just kind of going on forever and ever. So I changed that to kind of kill it in case we ran into an issue, so you didn't just have it basically in an infinite loop, if you will. So new REST request. We have that request going. So again, we use that authentication URL here. That's just the base URL essentially for this REST client. And in the REST request, we actually can expand on that. And so I'm going to throw a token in there because that's actually the piece after this full path here. So we can go to token, and then the method that we're going to be using here is actually a post. And that's the way it receives the token. So I know I used get up here. It's really a post request. To me, it makes sense that you're getting a token. You're not posting a token, but again, feel free to name it however you'd like. The next thing we want to do is we actually have to do a base64 string convert of the client ID and client secret. This is just how the V2 of the token endpoint works. V1 did not work like that. It just passed the information straight. So if you're using V1 or have been using V1, something you might want to look at and make sure you have it up to date. So we're going to do convert dot to base64 string. And we want to do encoding dot etf8 dot get bytes. And what we want to do here is we actually need to interpolate the string. And we're going to do client ID. And then client ID. And then you do a colon. And then it's client secret. And then that is how we do the key piece here by encoding it to base64. Then we want to do a request.add header, and we want to do content type. That's not what we want. We want content type dot form URL encoded. Again, you want to check the reference guide for what the different content types are. Most of it's JSON. This is not the way it's passed. We want to add another header. We want to do accept content type JSON request. We need one more header here, which is going to be passing the key through. And make sure you're doing this where you need basic with one space, and then you have the key. Make sure that basic is capitalized. Those two things are very important when you're passing that through the authorization. The next piece we want to do is we need to add a parameter. And the parameter we want to pass first is the grant type, and we need to set that to client credentials. So that's what we're using on this endpoint to get client credentials. Again, that's primarily for a two-legged auth. If you're trying to do three-legged, or if you're doing other pieces with like the model derivative or the data management, you may need to get a different grant type for that. So just something to check with the references. Request, we're going to add one more parameter here, and we're going to add scope. And then what we want to do here is it's just a space, basically a space delimited string, but for the token, the only scope we need is data read. So we'll pass that scope in, at least to start with. And then the next thing we can do here is we've got the values coming out. So now we want a REST response. And response equals, so the client dot execute async. And I always, when I'm doing this, I always just go for a result. I don't actually execute any of this async just for the nature of how it works inside of Revit. If you're running as an add-in, async stuff doesn't usually work super well, especially if you're trying to do other things with it afterwards. So I always just throw the result in the back end, which makes it execute in line or in order as opposed to it actually truly going async. And the last thing we want to do here is we're going to actually do the JSON. I always want to name it JSON serializer, and then we want to deserialize. We want to deserialize this to the token class, and then it's the response.content. So what this line here, this is kind of like the magic, if you will, is the system.text.json reference is going to take the information, the JSON that's returned, the raw JSON that's returned from the response, get the result, and then once it has that content from the result, it's actually going to turn it into the token class. And if you remember, that token class had the access token, some expiration information, and so forth in it. So once we did this, so this token is what's going to be returned out of this whole method. So just to kind of recap, we created the client, we passed in the base URL information, we extended that URL with the token at the very end on the request. We converted our client ID and client secret, again, two-legged auth through a base64 convert, added the headers that we needed, the authorization type. So you're passing the client ID, client secret that's been encoded through as the authorization, and that in turn actually provides you a full token that you can use to make the other calls with. So getting the token here, if you just pass these two bits of information through on, say, the project's endpoint, that's not going to work. So pass that there, the scopes, and then execute that and pull it through. So that is how we can get a token. Now, if we go back over to the project's endpoint, we're actually going to here, we want, again, you can pass what you would like to pass. What I normally pass is the token. Again, assuming you're calling this from somewhere else besides internally of the actual app that you want. Yeah, ID. Those are really the only two things that you actually need. And then I'm actually going to copy and paste here because this is very, very similar to what we need on the products endpoint. So if I copy and paste that from the tokens endpoint, what I want to do here is I want to change this to the accounts piece. So again, it's a different path. If we go back and look over here, that accounts v1 is actually the base URL with the base ACC v1 information, and then that has been concatenated with the accounts and the account ID information at the end. And you'll see on these strings, which we'll see why it's important here in a minute, but there are a couple of these things that are in curly brackets, and we do that so we can do a URL replace basically on it as we go through that later. So if we go back over to this projects endpoint, what we need here is just projects versus token, and this is an actual get operation, so we want to change that there. We don't need this piece anymore. And then we really only need the authorization header. In this case, we're going to change this to be the token, which we've passed through here. Once we've got another class, we've got that. We don't need client credentials anymore. And we don't need scopes. But what we are going to go back through is we're going to say request.add URL. So this is where we can go do the URL segment that we just seen. So if we do that account ID, which was in that string, and then we want to set that to the account ID that we are passing. So again, if we go look at this pass real quick, you can see this account ID in those curly brackets. Anything that's in those curly brackets becomes something that the RestSharp can go and hunt for. So by doing this URL segment, it's going to find that account ID in curly brackets in that string and replace it with the value that we have here. So it just makes it an easy way versus trying to do a bunch of concatenation in this, which you could do, and you could just type it all out here if you wanted to. It just helps make it a little bit simpler. In my opinion, that makes it simpler anyways when we're doing that. So we have the account ID, we're passing that through. And then what we want to do is we want to add a query parameter now, and this is where we're going to list fields, and this is just a comma delimited grouping of which fields we want returned. And since we made our projects model pretty small, then I only want to return the fields that we actually have in there. ID, I'm going to go ahead and list it, but ID is returned no matter what. So even if you don't list ID as a field here, it's going to be returned regardless. So that's the one value it will always return. If you leave this off or blank, essentially, it returns all fields by default. So we're going to say ID. I want to return the job number, and I'm going to return the project name. Again, these things are case sensitive, so make sure when you're doing them that it's like lowercase and then everything that's upper after that. So if you have any questions there, please just reference the ACC API docs. Everything's spelled out pretty well there, but it is important to get that correct. And then something that I find helpful, you certainly don't need to have it, but I do like to add a sort to it. So if we add one more parameter here, and then I like to do job number, and then you put, if you want ascending or descending on the back end. Our project numbers count up, obviously, and so I like to always do them descending, which gives me the newest projects first when I'm looking for stuff, because most often that's what I'll be doing work on. So that is just something I like to do, but certainly not critical for this. One other thing I might mention here is that we can also add a filter. Um, and the reason we can add a filter is that right when you've used this endpoint, all the get endpoints work for BIM 360 and ACC. So before I put this filter in there, if I was just to call this endpoint, it would give me all ACC and all BIM 360 projects. Now, if you're purely only on one platform or the other, then it probably doesn't matter to you. But we actually do have projects across both platforms. And so I always just like to return the ACC. The ACC is an enum that you have to pass, but you can also just do it as a string value. So if you add the query parameter here, you can just say filter, and then in brackets, you put what you are filtering on and its platform. Again, you can find reference to that in the API guide, but I'm just going to filter on platform, and I'm going to make that value ACC. So it will only look for projects that are on the ACC platform, therefore not returning any BIM 360 projects. So that's something that I like to put just because it makes it a little bit easier to kind of keep those more filtered. But again, nothing that's critical to have. So we're sorting, and then we're going to come down, we're going to do the response. And here is what we're going to do is, again, we're going to say projects. And again, that content now is going to be deserialized to the projects class. If you remember when we were in there, that means it's going to be the pagination information, which is all this, the limit and offset results. So again, limit, I think for projects, it defaults to 10 maybe, or it's either 10 or 100, I forget which one, but it's not a super large number. So it'll tell you there, it'll tell you you can sign offset or get offset if you make that call through the method or through the endpoint. So, if you have 250 results, it only can return 100, and you want like the second grouping of 100, then you would need to do an offset if you're not actually doing some kind of search or additional filtering to get the project information that you want. So here we've got the project. So this is actually all there is to this call. With this project's class or object being returned, you would just be able to then extract the actual list of project information. And then on the project information, you would get ID, name, and job number. Job number, again, is not critical. That's just something that helps, your internal, if you've been putting that information from an internal project numbering system, basically. The ID and name are really the two important parts. And quite honestly, if you're doing additional work, it's just ID. But at this point, if you were to load this up into another project, making sure obviously you get RestSharp references, your text JSON reference, you get those things, all your DLLs in the right spot, so you don't have issues there with things not found. But if you loaded this up, if you called the token endpoint with the correct client credentials, a client ID, and a client secret from your app. If you were to call that with that information, it would return you a token in which you could then call this on the projects, and you would get a listing of projects back based on the criteria that you passed. That is honestly as simple as it can be to start off getting things and pulling them through. So that's really all I want to show right now. I did want to show kind of how it all integrated working and back. It takes a little bit of time to get it connected. Maybe in another video in the future, we'll post kind of how that's working. But this should be a good reference to get you off the ground and moving in the right direction. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And if not, have a good weekend.